But now the fact that these can be powered by AI means there's a ready market for all forms of surveillance across all societies. And that is happening, like it or not. So I think anybody who's got a more democratic perspective on civil society should get their skates on.
Welcome to VoxDevTalks. My name is Tim Phillips. Geopolitical alliances are changing rapidly. Technological innovation is reshaping our economies. These trends offer a cocktail of risk and reward for countries in the global south. They are also both topics that are familiar to Simon Johnson of MIT. When I spoke to him recently, I asked him about how policy should respond to President Trump, deglobalisation, and artificial intelligence. And, of course, what it was like to win the Nobel Prize. Simon Johnson, welcome to VoxDevTalks.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Simon, last time I spoke to you was about 6 or 7 years ago. You probably won't remember. How's the career going? Anything happened since then?
I've had ups and downs, Tim, like the global economy, but I've had a good few months after winning the Nobel Prize and picking up the medal from the King of Sweden in December.
Congratulations on that. One thing that I notice about winning the Nobel is it brings your work to a lot of people's attention and brings it back to a lot of people's attention. People tend to have a lot of opinions these days, positive and negative. How has that process been? Is it pleasant? Is it something you welcome?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the work, as you say, was done some time ago. I mean, the most productive sort of big body of work that won the prize was about 20 years ago, although we've done follow-up and I like to think we've been pretty consistent since then. But a lot of people want to talk about inclusive institutions versus extractive institutions. Of course, we were writing about sort of the long sweep of history and trying to establish some causal links there. But it's a hot topic right now in the United States. You know, is this policy or that policy or these individuals, are they being extractive here? What does it mean to be extractive? What is real inclusion? What's the value of inclusion? Why should we have inclusion? So these are actually remarkably current topics.
Yes, you've always taken that long sweep of history approach to them. In this time now where we're seeing a lot of geopolitical change and we're all fascinated and sometimes horrified by what's going on around the world, how important, how significant do you think this is, taking that long view?
Oh, this is a big moment. There's no question. And it's been a big moment for a while. I think it probably, when the historians look back, they'll see a couple of things. First is the first Trump administration, which changed a lot of thinking in the United States and around the world. It represented, of course, a move, a new conservatism, a move to the right, whatever we want to call it. It was a new autocracy kind of attitudes. And that was 2016, of course. But then I think the really big change, Tim, is the arrival of AI, because AI has shifted the power balance in the private sector, is providing these new technologies that can be fantastic for humans, or they can be massively debilitating and wipe out lots of opportunities for humans. Maybe they'll wipe out humans, we'll see, but wiping out a lot of jobs. And I think that it's this mixture of a very harsh version of what government can, should do, or won't do, a leaning away from redistribution through taxation and so on, at the same time as an intense burst of technology in the hands of a few people. So we don't know how this is going to play out, but it's going to be very big. It's going to be very global. And of course, a lot of it, enormous amount is centered in the United States. Almost all the AI development right now is in the US. So whatever happens in the US, for whatever strange parochial reasons, is going to spread around the world, does spread around the world super fast, in part because we already have these digital distribution networks.
Yes, and this is something that we tend to focus on locally to us in our own countries. But as you say, this is a global movement, isn't it? It will have impacts in low, middle-income countries.
Oh, absolutely. So if you just think in terms of jobs, clerical work, anything involves writing, anything involves reviewing documents, anything that involves assessing, is this an appropriate claim? How can I help this person who's calling in for help with something? Any of these interactions that we have that we used to think of we've always thought of them as cognitive tasks. Call centers, cognitive task, right? Okay, there's a script, but you're talking to a person. The person is trying to figure some stuff out for you. Now, all of these jobs can already be done by AI. And that statement was true last week. And this week, there's new releases of the technology that are better than the previous releases. I have a course on this at MIT running right now, and I have some extremely talented and well-briefed students in my class, and they are learning an enormous amount from me and my colleagues. It's just shocking how much new stuff is becoming available, not across all of human activities, but definitely across these cognitive tasks that are scripted or semi-scripted, semi-routine, some people call them.
We're going to talk more about technology later, but first of all, we can't discuss geopolitics without discussing Trump. President Trump, when he was standing for election this time, he promised tariffs, he promised protectionism, he promised to disengage from international aid. Within weeks, he made that happen. Do we have to assume that these changes are now baked in for the long term?
Well, I think the key thing about Mr. Trump is he likes the headlines. He likes the media. He spends a lot of time with the media every day, and he wants the announcements. And I think back, Tim, a lot to this. You remember this big announcement during the first administration that Foxconn was going to put a massive investment into Wisconsin, very important political state, and they were going to build flat screen displays. Well, I think you and I could go up there right now and have a look around those fields, and I'm not sure we'd see anything at all, Tim. But the announcement was big. Right. So he's all about the announcement. On the foreign aid, we'll see what happens. I mean, yes, he's cut USAID programs, or maybe he's just moved to the State Department. The leverage he's trying to use over the Middle East right now, over Egypt and Jordan, is about aid and assistance. So that's actually how the Americans have always used their aid.
Nevertheless, since Trump won, we have seen a gradual process of deglobalisation, a movement away from that trend that sustained for a couple of decades. Does that mean now that in the process of development, low middle income countries should be focusing more on generating their growth internally?
Well, I think there's been disillusion with globalization and the place of various countries in that process for a long time, Tim. And actually, a lot of that disillusion came from the developing countries themselves. So I think turning inward makes some sense. Also trading regionally. If you look at Africa, for example, there's relatively little trade within Africa. So lowering those barriers would be a very smart thing to do. And that's also what Asian countries have been working on for a while. Are we having a deglobalization moment? Yes, in some sense. And tariffs are edging upwards in the US. I agree to that. But at the same time, there's been a massive boom in imports from China, from Guangzhou, for example. There are these been a flood of goods to the world that are customs duty free because they're under a certain de minimis threshold. And this is a hot item in the news right now because these imports have real impact on competitors. And should you allow this kind of exemption? But on the other hand, if you're going to inspect every parcel coming into the United States, that's a lot of parcels. And how does that fit with reducing the federal workforce? All good questions to be resolved soon.
In that argument, it sounds like you're saying that instead of withdrawing from trade and being protectionist in turn, that developing countries should be looking for trade elsewhere, because we do have a history of protectionism as a path to development. That doesn't have a great track record, does it?
Right, that's absolutely right. So it was known as import substitution in a previous version. It was very hot in the 1950s. It was adopted in a lot of Latin American countries. In the 1950s and early 1960s, the development economists of the day felt that Latin America was going to do rather well, and they were more skeptical about Asia, East Asia in particular. And of course, what turned out was the opposite, that East Asia did well, primarily because of the export focus, and Latin America proved disappointing. But the point I would emphasize, Tim, is it's not trade good or bad. It's a question of what kind of trade and what you do with the trade. So, what Singapore did very consciously, and what we've also seen happen in South Korea and definitely in Taiwan and some other places, is they used trade to upgrade skills, to upgrade the workforce, and they were always thinking about moving up the value chain. So, Singapore started out, if we go back 60 years, they were sewing garments, and now they're at the forefront of biomedical research. And they've moved up, and they've always been about, we want to upgrade the workforce, we want better skills, we want to bring in the foreign investors, we want partnerships, we don't want this to be exploitative. This is not about extracting value from our people, this is about building more shared prosperity. So you can use trade in that way, and you can use your foreign partnerships. But if you fall into that part of the global value chain that's all about, extracting minerals, for example, so-called critical minerals or rare earths are a fairly hot topic right now also, you can find yourself in a bad place where the foreigners take stuff, they pollute the waters, you don't get a lot in terms of local jobs, and then you've got a big cleanup mess left behind, and nobody, I think, should want that in the modern world.
It's very important who you choose as trade partners. China has been very active in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, for a long time. We're seeing increased activity from Russia in those areas. Is it inevitable that there will be a geopolitical shift toward more trade with Russia and China?
Well, the Russians, I think, are just troublemakers, honestly, and they're mostly about political control and perhaps take control over a government and then try and get some raw materials into their own economy. But they're not big players right now, Tim. They're pretty disorganized. They've taken some big losses. They are, I would say, pawns in the chess game where the China is a major player. Now, the Chinese, of course, have got some serious domestic issues. Their dependence on exports is a bit excessive, and they've actually handed a vulnerability to Trump. And we'll see how the Europeans play it. But so we'll not clear how it ends for China. But the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, has somewhat run out of steam. I think you'll see Trump push back against that. That's the point of the Panama gambit that he's made, which is going quite well from Mr. Trump's perspective right now. Panama has given 90 days notice to withdraw from the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think that's how Greenland entered into the play as well. So the U.S. versus China, Russia is either a bit player or a pawn on the Chinese side. I think Mr. Putin really represents and works for President Xi. And it is the great game, again, the greatest of the great games. Just as the European empires played the great games, in Afghanistan and Central Asia, this is a global geopolitical competition to particularly, I would say, develop technology, own the technology of the future. Because if you shape technology, you can impose your priorities and your preferences on it, and you can determine a lot of things about your own national prosperity, about who gets good jobs, and about national security.
Now, with the way the great game is being played at the moment, particularly with slowing global growth, high indebtedness among many poor countries, are those international institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, who have traditionally been at the center of this, are they still fit for purpose at the moment? You, of course, have close experience of the IMF. Do they need any kind of reform?
Well, the IMF and the World Bank always need reform and adjustment. I mean, it's quite remarkable that they still exist, honestly, because they were created in 1944, the Bretton Woods Conference, for a very different world, particularly and primarily focused on rebuilding Europe and bringing Europe into a pro-market stance, as opposed to drifting into the communist world one way or another. So the fact that they've remained useful a lot of the time is quite an achievement. And of course, I think we also have to be realistic. It's very unlikely we'd ever have another Bretton Woods. It's very unlikely you'd be able to get people around the table and say, yes, we agree on what the ownership should be, what the capital should be, and what the priorities should be. So I think the World Bank and the IMF are important and play a role. I do think that they are pieces in the chess game. I do think that their headquarters are currently located a few steps from the White House for a reason. By the way, if the US were to change its relationship with those institutions, for example, pull out, they would have to move. The charter of the institution is quite clear that they need to be headquartered in the capital of the largest shareholder. So we'll see what moves the Trump administration makes with respect to those institutions. I don't think we've seen any clear statements yet on that.
So we could see those institutions with a much louder voice for particularly China in the future. What about Russia? Russia's involvement in them? Well,
Russia's involvement in them is an embarrassment, frankly. I mean, I was among the people who said they should have been expelled because the full-scale invasion of Ukraine was so shocking and horrifying. Look, it was so shocking that the Swedes and the Finns are no longer neutral. The Swedes were neutral for 200 years. The Finns were neutral throughout the Cold War. As soon as Putin went in, they said, right, the world has changed. We want to join NATO. So that's pretty dramatic. And I think it's an unfortunate facet of these institutions that the way in which they govern, which has a very big European voice, by the way, for historical reasons, they felt that they couldn't even suspend Russian membership. And I think they will look back on that with regret, because when you step outside the scope of reasonable activity, I don't think you should be able to belong to the community of nations on the same basis as before.
Now, we all think much more about the suitability and the strength of institutions at the moment. You have a lot of responsibility for that. I was speaking recently to Massimo Morelli, who was arguing that deglobalisation leads to instability in developing countries, low middle income countries, because there's factions within many of those countries fighting over a smaller pie. At a moment like this, does it become increasingly important that those countries have strong institutions to be able to hold them together to avoid conflict.
Yes, I mean, almost by definition, the way you stated the problem. But I would say, deglobalization can do that, but also so can globalization. If you have a big shock that runs through financial markets or around the world economy, think about the 1980s, for example, Latin American debt crisis, the boom-bust kind of cycle. I mean, you can say, look, it's integrating into the global economy without strong corporate governance, without strong financial regulation, without strong political institutions that can manage conflict and so on. But I think the point that when the pie shrinks, it gets nasty, that's true everywhere. And by the way, it's true also in the United States, where the pie has not shrunk, but the piece of the pie that came to lower income Americans has been under pressure for a long time, partly from in large part from technology developments, also from globalization. So the decline, the pressure on the lower 80% and definitely the lower 20%, and the sense of people being left behind, you can have that even when the headline growth is supposedly or apparently respectable.
We have recently become very aware of the centralizing nature of technology entrepreneurs. Whether or not you agree with what Elon Musk is attempting to do in the US, you can still feel uncomfortable that he is unelected and seems to be wielding a great deal of power. This reminded me of some of the arguments you were making in your book, Power and Progress. Is this the sort of thing that you were warning about?
Yes. Actually, we had a discussion, John and I, with ourselves and our publishers and our lawyers about the extent to which we should discuss Mr. Musk. And if you look at the book, chapter 2 of the book is about Ferdinand de Lesseps, who was this fascinating, eventually overbearing and overly powerful Frenchman from the 1870s and particularly the 1880s, who was incredibly successful and used that success to launch this massive Panama Canal building project. But it turned out to be all about hubris, and he didn't understand what he was getting into, and it ended in disaster. I always thought that was a pretty good metaphor for the tech barons, including Mr. Musk. But the book came out in 2023. We did not want to get ahead of events. The key point is Musk has some tech credibility, and he's built some stuff. Right? Tesla, SpaceX. He runs X, formerly Twitter, although more controversial about how that's going. But and he's definitely bringing technology people into all kinds of federal agencies, and he's using tech to centralize at least executive authority. So the authority of the president within the executive branch is going to become a lot stronger because of what Mr. Musk has done. Now, how that's used eventually in terms of policy is a fascinating question. Franklin Delano Roosevelt would have been delighted to have Mr. Musk on his team and centralize executive authority, because you can do lots of things when you have that. The fragmentation of executive authority and judicial review, by the way, those have been tenets of belief for the conservative side of American politics for a century, not the left, not the progressives, not the left wing. So Mr. Trump is creating a progressive dream world in some sense.
And we tend to worry very much about these tech barons, as you call them, because, well, they live among us. In other places in the world where technology is less advanced and there aren't these extraordinarily rich people running very large organizations, should they be worrying about this centralization of power?
Well, first of all, I don't think the tech barons live among us, Tim. I think they live in separate parallel lives. You'll never see them on a commercial plane. They don't live among us. And that's important, right? Because they have their own visions and their own competing visions. They do fight among themselves, and that's actually a point in our favor. I'd like to come back to that. But around the world, of course, this is the shaping of technology. Where did personal computers come from? Where did the internet come from? Where did the jet engine come from? Actually, the answer is the US had a big influence on all of those things. But even more influence now is evident in the development of artificial intelligence. And, ChatGPT was the technology heard around the world within 24 hours. I mean, I not yet found a corner of the world that wasn't already playing with that tech as soon as it came out and imagining things they could do with it and so on and so forth. But the vision behind that technology is the vision of a few people who primarily focused on the West Coast of the United States, and who have various views about themselves, about their role in the world, and now about Mr. Trump. But this is incredibly influential. This is technology shaping the world. And that was the key premise of Power and Progress, of course, which is, if you invent it and you drive it and you can make money off it, it's adopted around the world, and it's adopted in very different societies than the society that invented it. But as it's adopted in any society, it reshapes that society and pushes it in a certain direction, including, one can reasonably imagine, a concentration of power, which could be local. That's what a lot of industrialization did, but it could also be global, so that all the power gets pulled or sucked into the United States.
We're thinking all the time now about putting guardrails on AI, finding policy for it. Is that something that every country should be looking at, how AI can be used within the country and how to put those guardrails on?
Well, you're thinking about it all the time, Tim, because you don't live in the United States, I'm guessing. Yes, people outside the United States are thinking about it. In the US, nobody is thinking about this. I mean, there was some discussion last year. I would say there was some intelligent, smart, sensitive discussion behind closed doors. But even last year, people would say, well, what about China? And then the US regulatory discussion or guardrails would fade away. Under Mr. Trump, I mean, there's a reason these people paid big money to sit really close to the Trump family at the inauguration. It's pay for play. I mean, you can call it corruption if you want. I have no problem with that word. It turns out to be legal, so it's legal corruption. But the pay to play is, we give you money, we give you an echo chamber of some kind, and you don't get in our way, and you cheer us when we announce our big investments, some of which, of course, are hype, but a lot of them are real. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the Trump administration and the tech sector. And then the tech sector, of course, is coming traditionally from a different place politically, and many people thought that they had a progressive influence and so on and so forth. But when the people driving this technology had to weigh their sort of social positions and preferences against the prospect of making a lot more money, well, capitalism does what it says on the box, doesn't it?
And if I am a policymaker in Burundi or Burkina Faso or Bangladesh, what should I be thinking about AI now?
So I think the play here, Tim, is to think about what you want to achieve with this technology. So economists love to talk about the law of unintended consequences, which is surely always in effect. But I like the law of intended consequences, which can be translated as, you score 0 goals when you don't take shots on goal. I'm using the soccer metaphor, hoping that's more global for your audience, but there's versions in every sport. So the point is that, what's the problem you want to solve? What is it you could do with AI? What would help your society? And I think it differs a lot by society, but there's also common elements. And what I say to people from, I don't know, I had a conversation not so long ago with people from Indonesia, another conversation with people in Brazil. And I said, look, if you have this goal of improving the lives and livelihoods of rural farmers who have certain kinds of, conditions and social structures around them, why don't you find other people in other lower income countries and put it out to bid and say, look, we're 1 billion farmers or consumers or moped riders or whatever it is, and this is what we need. And if you build it, we will buy it. So this is the same idea as we have for vaccine development, which is you pre-commit money. Now, vaccine development, another controversial topic right now in the US, but it's usually government money that does the pre-buy. And that's part of the vulnerability. I'm suggesting that it's government, private sector partnerships, whatever you want to call it, around lower income countries. We say, here's the problem we've got. This is what we want the solution to look like. There's a market here. Come and build it. Because if you don't do that, all the building and all the design is entirely focused on what high-end consumers want in the US, which is not necessarily what you want in Burundi or Indonesia. So I think that is a sensible approach. And by the way, I mean, just to sort of darken the conversation a little bit, if we needed that, authoritarian regimes around the world are doing exactly this, aren't they? They're clearly in the market for surveillance technologies already and for a long time. But now the fact that these can be powered by AI means there's a ready market for all forms of surveillance across all societies. And that is happening, like it or not. So I think anybody who's got a more democratic perspective on civil society should get their skates on.
Something we talk about regularly on VoxDevTalks is the struggle to create work, create enough good jobs for often the very young populations of low middle income countries. I was struck by, in Power and Progress, you told the story, Norbert Wiener, who was one of your predecessors at MIT. And his argument was that machines were slave labor, and so anyone competing with slave labor had to accept the economic consequences of slave labor. So if we treat AI in the same way, Is this undermining the potential to create enough good jobs in future?
Perhaps, and I think it's a very important perhaps, and we could talk about probabilities, but the key point that we're trying to get across in the book and in our subsequent and current work at MIT is there's a choice here, because while it's true that machines, including algorithms running on computers, AI now, it's true there's a heavy automation element, automation being, okay, I had these people before, I don't need them anymore, I'll put the machine in. There's also a new task creation. And if so what Norbert Wiener didn't anticipate, I mean, I think his warnings were prophetic, and I think they're really important today. But what we got from that phase of the machine age was the creation of a lot of new tasks that require human expertise. And that's what you get paid money for, money above a subsistence wage, money above what gets paid to people who just walking off the street with no special skills. So new task creation, and my colleague David Autor at MIT has done fantastic work on this. It's sort of a race between, and Dron Asimoglu also has worked on this. It's a race between how fast you automate the jobs, because those go away. And some of those were good jobs. I mean, some of them were very hard jobs. So I'm from Sheffield in the north of England. We had a lot of hard jobs over many, many years in steel, in coal and steel, for example. But as those jobs go away, partly due to automation, do you create new tasks in creative industries, in industries that require specialized skills? Do you have to pay your workers good money to retain them? Do you want them to get trained and have special skills? That's the magic. And that's what has gone well in some episodes in what we call industrialized countries over the past 200 years. It did not go well in the last 40 years, because in the last 40 years, we automated a lot of jobs in the middle of the income distribution, pushed those people down to the lower end where it's very competitive, you don't make good money. And some people did very well, highly educated people, but the middle's been really squeezed, and the less educated feel like they've been massively left behind, which they have. So if you take that on a global scale and think about AI now, and think about what does it do to manufacturing, what does it do to call centers, what does it do to any of the industries that generate relatively good jobs and a ladder of potentially escaping poverty in low middle income countries, I think there's some problems ahead.
That was a point that was made to me also by your colleague Paul Collier, who I believe is also from Sheffield.
Oh, good question. I haven't checked with them recently, but I'm willing to believe it. There's a lot of talented people from Sheffield, I can promise you. Seb Coe would be another one. Joe Root, I think, would resonate with some of your audiences and so on.
Finally, just a big question for you. Bearing in mind these changes we've been discussing, and the fact that you consider them to be very significant historical changes, we're seeing a lot of different types of policy response to them now. If you were making policy in one of these countries looking for growth and development, what would you consider to be a good basket of policies, and what would be a bad basket of policies?
I think they need to study and think about the dynamics and the industrial organization of AI. I think that's the key. And I think that the latest developments suggest that even though these tech barons are spending massive amounts of money and they're engaged in this enormous arms race, what they're really doing is commoditizing AI. And the value is going to be on the front end. It's going to be the interface, because you don't really care how your request is processed. Is it done by OpenAI? Is it done by Google? Is it done by Anthropic? It doesn't matter to you whatsoever. So strangely and ironically, this is not like Google and search right now, because we all got hooked on Google and we all started using it, and that's very sticky. You can plug in a lot of different AI backends and switch them around already, and very soon you're going to be making choices about that. And even after that, you won't make a choice; it'll just happen, and you'll decide whether or not you like it. So I think getting in with the people who would like you to own the front end, building those partnerships with people, and trying to persuade them that they can access this significant market and play a beneficial social role and really help with development. Now, that's a different vision. That's not the vision that motivates Microsoft or Google or OpenAI currently. But there are people you can talk to. And I think if you put together the buying power, if you go to them and say, look, we're a small country in this part of the world, we don't have a lot of money, could you help us out? You're going to be pretty far down the pecking list. You say, look, we're 1 billion farmers and we need solutions. And we're having I just came in from Beijing and we had some conversations there, but we'd rather buy it from you. What have you got? Now, that's interesting. The way to play the great game, Tim, of course, is to play them off against each other. right? The great game can be switched. I mean, if you let the big powers push you around and go for the military intervention and so on, of course that ends badly. Everyone knows that. But if you turn it against them and you play the game in a smart way, then you can get your hands on technology quite cheaply. You can use it to solve problems. I mean, look, the answer, I know there's enormous hand-wringing in Europe, for example, about, oh my goodness, what's the future? We're so pessimistic and so on. I mean, honestly, the Americans have just vacated the entire territory of clean energy. It's gone. They're not going to do it. What a fantastic opportunity for Europe to go full speed ahead, because they need it, everyone else needs it, and the Americans will need it eventually too, right? And powering that with AI and your own AI applications suited to your situations with appropriate guardrails, that's a fantastic project. But on the other side, there are many brilliant European experts working on AI right now, and all the ones I know are in the United States. So, the sucking sound, the talent being drawn to the US is a problem you have to contend with.
Let's hope that our policymakers do manage to play the great game well. There's a lot at stake at the moment. Thank you for talking about it to me today.
Thanks very much.
If you want to go back to where it all began, then the reference paper is Acemoglu, Johnson and Robinson, 2001, The Colonial Origins of Comparative Development, an Empirical Investigation. And that was published in the American Economic Review, 91, number 5. We've also been discussing the book that Simon published with Daron Acemoglu, Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. This has been a VoxDevTalk. The best way to make sure you don't miss an episode is to subscribe. You find us wherever you get your podcasts. All our past episodes, as always, are at voxdev.org. If you like what you see and hear, tell someone else about us.